Yesterday, just posted a video where I debriefed a recent conversation I had with Trent Horn discussing abortion and specifically his view and my skepticism about his view that I call it's a pro-life absolutist position, which says that from the point of conception, when a new human organism begins to exist, a human being begins to exist at the point of conception, that human being has now the same ontological status at that moment as it ever has at any subsequent moment, and thus the killing of the human organism at the point of conception onwards is morally equivalent to at any subsequent stage. So what follows from that um, is, for example, and this is one example that we discussed. If a woman has intercourse and there's a contraception failure, and then she goes the next morning to her doctor and she gets a morning after pill. The way that the morning after pill functions is one of the ways is to prevent the implantation of a fertilized embryo into the uterine wall, which will result in the death of the fertilized embryo. And so, on this view, that is murder. It is equivalent to if the woman with a full term newborn fetus, well, newborn baby, if she took that baby into her doctor and got the baby to smother the doctor with a pillow or to inject it with potassium chloride and kill it, that is a morally equivalent action. Taking the morning after pill is a morally equivalent murder to killing a newborn infant, which is clearly murder. And the truth is that the vast majority of people in society don't have that view. They believe that there is clearly some ontological development in the status of a human organism in the earliest moments. So even though a human uh, being begins to exist at conception, most people believe that killing that human being, while still a morally weighty, significant thing to do, and one requiring clear justification, that killing an embryo or a human blastocyst, which is a ball of cells 5 days, 6 days post conception, that's just not morally equivalent to smothering an infant with a pillow. That seems to me to be a fairly uh, strong position to take. It is certainly is a position that most people hold, that they are not absolutists about the ontological status of the fetus, embryo, in utero. So that they recognize at some point, and as I said in my video yesterday, certainly by the second into third trimester, most people are recognizing that at that point it seems that the fetus now has full ontological status, which is why only 13% of people in a Gallup survey in 2018, only 13% believe there should be elective abortion in the third trimester, but 62% believe there should be elective abortion access in the first trimester. So the belief that there should be access to abortion spread almost 2/3 of the population in the first trimester. It drops to 13%. 87% do not think that should happen in the third trimester, which clearly shows most people recognize there's an ontological significant change in the fetus in utero over time. It's not entirely clear whether when or where that is, and you should certainly, I think, err on the side of caution with respect to that. But there clearly is a recognition that there's ontological growth. But absolutists do not like that position. They do not want to concede that it is. I mean, sometimes they want to concede that. I mean, for example, Trent is a wonderful interlocutor, and he's an absolutist. But I find commonly lay absolutists, they're inimical to, very opposed to recognizing any other views, particularly among Christians. Now, this is. I mean, it's one of the things it says to me is from growing up back in the 1980s, the thing that we always heard about, I'm trying to remember the group, Keith Green. I don't know if you know who Keith Green is, but he was a Christian singer, died in 1982. His wife, Melody Green, was very involved in an anti-abortion or pro-life group in the 1980s. And I was very interested in consuming their literature all the time. And I was hearing about abortion all the time. And so back in the 1980s and early 90s, conservative evangelical ethics, one of the biggest things that you'd always hear about was abortion and the evils of abortion. And there's a few other things that you'd hear about as well. You wouldn't hear about things like war, guns, poverty, um, climate change in climate justice and all these other things, the ethics of corporate business. No, the one thing that you always heard about was abortion, and evangelical ethics was defined by their stance on abortion. And because of that, I mean, that's still the case today for many conservative evangelicals, that one of the very few things they absolutely agree you must have a position on is being pro-life. And often, so being pro-life means the absolutist position on being pro-life. And because of that, that is essentially a part of their creed of what it is to be a Christian. Then any challenging of that, they just kind of lose it on you, and you are now outside the camp because you've rejected that one thing. It doesn't matter what you say about, you know, immigrants. Very often, and you could take, be with Donald Trump and treat refugees at the border as if they are pathogens coming in caravans to invade the country. But as long as you treat the fetus in utero from the moment of conception as having full ontological worth with any moment post conception, then you are in the camp. And I think that that's very much sort of an ethical reductionism. Anyway, what I want to do now with that rather long preamble is just take a look at some of the comments and respond quickly to some of the comments that have been posted since the video came online yesterday. All right, so here's the video. We're just going to scroll down. Okay, the first fellow says, definitely disagree with you on this. The first moment of any human's existence seems to logically be the moment of conception and not an arbitrary point in time in utero. Two problems with this first comment. Well, let me start with the second comment. So the first moment of a human's existence is the moment of conception, logically. Well, it's clearly not logical. I mean, it's a biological question, first of all. But the second point is, I didn't dispute this. I noted that there's a minority view. I think it's a minority view that's would place the beginning of the human organism at implantation, and I think that's incorrect. I think you should place it at conception. I didn't say anything to dispute that. What I was talking about, I thought quite clearly, was that the issue of whether there's a reasonable position that there is ontological development in the status of the human organism in utero, so that from the moment of conception, we can't conclude that the blastocyst or embryo is morally equivalent to the infant, such the killing of a blastocyst would be morally equivalent to killing of an infant. And I was simply pointing out that people reasonably disagree on this. So the absolutist position, pro-life position, is not the only game in town for a informed person of goodwill or a Christian of informed of goodwill. And so Nathan Vanny, the first commenter here, didn't seem to understand what the video was about, which is disappointing. Second one seems to be in a similar situation. So it's Matthew Fernley says, I disagree with this, but I respect your endeavor to persuade with reasoning rather than attack. He says, if I may ask, do you think there's a specific point in time where a genetic human being becomes alive? Yes, conception, at the moment of conception. So I thought I had addressed that. But I appreciate Matthew's generous comment as well. So here's another gentleman, C.W. Streeper says, Christian ethics should be one of the things that unites the body of Christ and separates the church from the non-believing world around us. And then he goes on and says he doesn't like what I wrote here. Well, I'm sorry to report to me, Mr. Streeper, but ethics has always been an issue on which Christians have divided. Back to the early church, right? Christians earliest church, the first couple centuries, the majority position was a pacifistic position, and then beginning in the 200s, Christians began to enter the military. Although Tertullian certainly didn't think that was a good thing. It was only after the conversion of Constantine that the Christian church largely began to adopt a view that Christians could participate in the military, and then you have Augustine in the 400s developing a theory of just war, and the pacifistic position now retreats into the minority. But that has remained an ongoing live debate throughout church history, defending pacifism, just war theory. That's one of 1,000 topics that Christians debate. And another one of the topics that Christians debate in terms of ethics is abortion, and it always has been. Christians have, I mean, if you look at Thomas Aquinas arguing a particular position on abortion in the 1200s, a view that the infant only becomes or sorry, the fetus only becomes a living, full human being at the time of quickening. Very common position. So when the woman can feel it, and then there were different views as to when whether a female fetus becomes has the imago Dei at the same time as a male, or whether the male is 40 days earlier than the female. These are all issues that have been and among the issues that continue to be debated when it comes to abortion. This is why we have things like ethics classes in seminary, is because Christians are all over the map debating different issues on ethics. So to say that the body of Christ must agree on ethics is just sets you up for failure, because they don't. And the next thing then is you then say, well, then, but if you disagree with me on an ethical question, then you're outside the camp. Well, okay, now what you are just doing is making your own church in the name of C.W. Streeper, right? That if you don't agree with me on ethics, then you're not in the camp, which I think is just unfortunate. And so one of the points of the video, that conversation that Trent and I had, is to illustrate how Christians reasonably disagree on these issues. Okay, I'm going to skip through some comments. I'm kind of just focusing on critical comments. Okay, so Max Hawkswell says, I think moral intuition is an important tool. However, I think it's dangerous to draw a line anywhere on the human development scale that allows the killing of some subset of human beings. There are definitely people who have a moral intuition that some disabled human beings are less valuable than humans without those disabilities. Okay, the problem with Mark Hawkswell's comment is he's ignoring the analysis, or overlooking, or not processing the analysis that I gave, which is to recognize there is something unique about the earliest stages of pregnancy, of gestation, where you have 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128 cells dividing and multiplying, eventually becoming a blastocyst, hollow ball of cells, and then becoming a later embryo. There's something different there at that earliest stage of human organism development than at subsequent points. And one of the ways, again, you illustrate this issue is through thought experiments. As I was saying, this is why you say, are you really taking the position that ending the life of a blastocyst, an embryo, through the taking of a morning after pill is really ontologically equivalent to killing a smothering a fetus or a 2-year-old? Because if it is, then we should be imprisoning for murder any doctor who prescribes a morning after pill, and we should be sentencing the women to. I mean, a woman that takes her infant to a doctor to get smothered, she's guilty of murder. If a woman is going into the doctor to get an embryo from terminated from her system by presenting implantation in the uterine wall, then she is guilty of murder, no less than the woman who smothered her infant. And most people don't think that. And again, if there were 100 frozen embryos in a fertility clinic and one crying infant, and the clinic is on fire, most people are going to save the one infant, because they recognize there's something unique about the infant that at that point, which is not unique yet about the embryos. And recognizing that fact, to think that then says, okay, then we can treat disabled human beings as somewhat less, is a non sequitur, because the whole point is that this is about something in the earliest stages of pregnancy. And any born human being who is disabled is not in the earliest stages of pregnancy. So it's just not recognizing what is being discussed. The other thing so there's another comment, and for some reason this one isn't showing up on YouTube, but I got an email notification of it, so I know that this was posted. I want to say a special word about this one. A fellow named Brian Bockinger. He says, I'm not going to read his whole comment, but he says, come on, Randall, you literally wrote a book in which you attack the concept of what you called Old Testament genocide. Well, I didn't call it that. It is that. There's an extended description of what genocide is, and demonstrating how what is described in Deuteronomy and Joshua meets the legal contemporary definition of genocide. But then he says, then you flip and justify an arbitrary redefinition of what it means to be human in order to justify the killing of babies in the womb. First of all, it's not arbitrary. I was pointing out with thought experiments and illustrations why most people recognize that the death killing of blastocyst 5 days post-conception is not morally equivalent to killing an infant. You can just say, okay, that's arbitrary, but no, those are actually intuitions that people hold. But then this language, he says that I'm going to justify the killing of babies in the womb. This is exactly the kind of irresponsible, over-the-top, heated, and just false rhetoric that is used by absolutists that is just really poisons the discourse. A blastocyst is not a baby. A blastocyst at 5 days post-conception is a human organism, is a human being. Whether you think that qualifies as a human person depends on your philosophy of personhood, which is actually a fairly rarefied and difficult discussion. But I think it's clearly a human organism or a human being. But it's not a baby. A baby is a human organism that has been undergone parturition or has been born, has undergone birth, and has emerged from the woman. So prior to that, it is a fetus, prior to that, an embryo, and then a blastocyst at these earliest stages of the embryonic stage. And you actually have to be responsible with your language, because simply calling people baby killers because they say, you know what, taking a morning after pill that results in the failure of a blastocyst to implant and thus the eventual death of the blastocyst, while it may be a morally weighty thing to do, it may be a wrong thing to do, it's not morally equivalent to smothering an infant with a pillow or injecting potassium chloride into an infant in order to kill it. They're just not ontologically, morally the same thing. Now, if you respond, you are a baby killer by taking that view, I mean, that's just silly and it's offensive. And the thing that what you end up doing there is marginalizing the pro-life position by tying it to extremism, an extremism that only a very small subset of the human population finds to be plausible or credible. And when you in turn tie that to Christianity, you further saddle Christianity with your extremist views that treats blastocysts as equivalent to babies and projects the language of babies back onto blastocysts. Now, you can do that, but I think that what you're doing is simply marginalizing yourself from the wider conversation, and you're harming the Christian church, and you're harming reasonable, charitable, ethical discussion on what is a very heated topic. The last thing that the discussion about abortion needs is more heated, irresponsible rhetoric. What we need is people who are using language precisely and striving to understand others with goodwill and understand how other people can actually disagree with them on this issue, just as people can disagree on a whole range of ethical issues and have throughout the history of the church.